So the title of this exhibition is Nine-Tailed Tall Tales, Trickster, Mongrel, Beast. And it was really important for me to include the nine-tailed fox spirit within the title of the exhibition to give an indication that there was an animal that potentially had the abilities to shapeshift and transform their image. For me, it's been really important thinking about this character not only from the perspective of East Asian mythology, which I think a lot of the Korean Space K audiences will be familiar with, but also in the UK and in Europe, and even within North America, where the animal maybe has the similar qualities but is a coyote. This idea of an animal that lives amongst humans and is also often thought of in a negative light. We often think of them as pests or something we want to get rid of. And I think traditionally in folklore globally, the fox is considered kind of a wily, unruly outsider character that's not to be trusted. And that's also something you can see within Korean mythology of the nine-tailed fox spirit. But I've always really been interested in this character as almost like a hero or a heroine with redeeming qualities, even if they are considered to be tricky. Because I suppose the crux of this exhibition is to think about characters within present and historical times that have to behave in certain ways in order to move safely through society to ensure their survival. So one of the things that I always think about quite deeply when I'm invited to do an exhibition is how will I respond to the space? And so the space here at Space K is very large, and I think if it's not broken down, it can be quite intimidating. And so for me, the main thing I wanted to think about was how would the audience encounter my artwork, how would they move through the space, and what kind of journey I could offer them. So I usually start off with one singular idea, whether it's the kind of concept of the exhibition or a structured anchor point where I can build objects around that piece. And so for this exhibition, I knew I wanted to show two works from 2022. I think they're behind me if you can see them. They're the textile works. Koreans will be familiar with them as pojagi, so a kind of traditional Korean patchwork. And I think within the geometrical shapes, there's almost a maze-like quality. So one of the things that me and my partner Benito designed was this idea of this maze within the exhibition, which would also reflect, I suppose, the formal images that you might see in these patchwork pieces, but also because the maze is something that heroes often encounter within stories and have to overcome kind of challenges or obstacles in order to find an en route destination. I also think about this maze as being kind of like a labyrinth. So labyrinths, unlike mazes, have only one entry and one exit point, and they're kind of considered more of a meditative or a spiritual journey. So in many ways, I'm always thinking about ways in which the audience can move through an exhibition and feel like they're going on a journey and encountering each work as it unfolds in front of them. In the back of the exhibition, you have this large house structure, which maybe looks like a stage or a shrine or indeed a house. So that is originally a reference from an exhibition that I recently had in London at the Whitechapel Gallery. And there it appeared more as a full structured house, which was, again, a loose reference of a hanok or a traditional Korean house, or just kind of a stereotypical A-frame structure that I think globally we would recognize as shelter or a home. Here it appears more as, I guess, a cut-through section of that house. And I wanted it to feel like a stage where the possibility of a live performance could happen. And even if something was not there happening, I guess it's always a potential that something might occur at a later moment. I also think that it was an interesting idea to have the end part of what looked like that Whitechapel structure to be pushing through the wall of Space K, almost as if it was a section of the gallery that I suppose maybe had an invisible portal, or there was a way in which you could traverse time and space and kind of enter that other gallery space, which was in London. And it also does kind of reference a shrine, and the animals or the characters that exist within the images within the shrine don't have any humans, which is also really important to me. So within my work, I'm really interested in referencing aspects of traditional Korean craft or folklore or performance. I think for me, as someone who grew up in North America, I've always really been attracted to those aspects of Korean culture, most likely because those were my first kind of entry points into understanding the culture where my family is from, because I would often hear stories that my mom would tell me at night when I was a child, or indeed be exposed to kind of more folk performances or activities, maybe if they were being held in Canada as a way to promote or celebrate Korean culture. Korean shamanism is something that I think is really important and interesting to me on, a variety of different levels. So I think from a perspective of someone who's grown up in a colonial country in Canada, I think it's deeply important as a non-Indigenous Canadian person to understand the history of that country, and I think it's the responsibility of not only Indigenous people in North America, but everyone who lives there to preserve and understand the culture that was originally there. And so similarly for me, when I learned that shamanism was the original ancestral cultural practice of Korea, I just thought it was really interesting from an anthropological perspective. And then later when I learned a little bit more about it, I really found it to be quite an interesting space where, again, from my Western perspective, a lot of feminist theory could be embedded within the kind of framework of how that religion was organized, how it's mainly women-led. And I was also really fascinated by the way in which traditional knowledge was historically passed down orally through oral storytelling. This to me seemed to mimic a lot of other kind of ancestral or indigenous practices globally, as opposed to more conventional or elevated aspects of scholarship that were transcribed by scribes and kind of considered the important things to preserve. So unlike a lot of shamanic practices, which have, as I said, been passed down orally, a lot of histories have been forgotten because those were stories that were suppressed or thought of as unimportant via the kind of ruling powers at the time. And so I think you have this history of a cultural practice that has been suppressed and has been really fighting hard for, essentially more than 1,000 years to kind of be present and stay true to itself. And I think that mimics a lot of how I feel about anti-colonial practices globally and within North America. And I think also just with regards to this idea of performance, the idea that the shaman is a performer and wears really beautiful and interesting regalia, there's this idea that they are also explaining different stories, passing down that knowledge historically, I think is fascinating. So I think that even if people have different religious perspectives, for me, as a person whose family comes from Korea, I think it's deeply important to just learn about the history of the country, and I think it definitely enriches one's knowledge and perspective of how traditional and contemporary Korean society are actually fundamentally based on something that is so ancient and ancestral. So the exhibition features a variety of animals that you can see repeated throughout the exhibition space. So I have chosen to represent images of seagulls, crows, foxes. There's, I think, a few tigers. And you will also notice that some of these animals appear almost as if they're in mid-transformation into another animal, or maybe they appear to be half human and half animal. The reason why I chose those animals in particular is because I have a personal relationship in my everyday to those creatures, as I think a lot of people in cities will do as well. So in London, where I live, there are a lot of foxes that live in and around the city that we often see. Crows are, of course, popular in many urban landscapes. There are a colony of seagulls near my studio, which I hear a lot, and seagulls often remind me of home because where I'm from in Vancouver, Canada, I grew up growing up beside the ocean, so whenever you live near water, you're always kind of surrounded by seagulls. I've also chosen these animals because they're considered to be, I suppose, nuisances or pests for people. And I think oftentimes the way we treat these animals in society is through kind of, I suppose, there's a type of almost hatred, I think, towards these kinds of animals. And I suppose there's a desire to always uplift and elevate animals that are considered the underdogs. Also within a lot of mythology and Korean folklore, the magpie appears a lot, and the magpie is, of course, part of the family of the crow. And the crow actually also represents my partner Benito, who, when he visited Vancouver a long time ago, he was really amazed to see how many crows there were. Crows also appear a lot in folklore. And the seagull, I actually feel, is almost like a self-portrait of myself. I think oftentimes when I imagine if I were to be an animal, I often think a seagull would be appropriate because of the way in which they're very tough and they have to think cleverly about how they're able to survive alongside humans. I also think foxes have a similar personality trait. You will also see images of my pet dog or my companion, who appears behind me. And I also have another image of a black dog, and this was my dog that I shared with Benito a few years ago, and he died in 2018, and he was a really important part of my life. So for me, I think animals, the way they exist in mythology and folklore, often serve as proxies or avatars for human characters, and I feel like I've done that within my practice and within this exhibition as well. So whilst you might see animals, and they are indeed animals, they are also representations of people as well. So I consider all animals and all living beings to have their own agency, and I often refer to animals as non-human people. So considering the idea that each animal has its own personhood or agency. So you'll notice that there's also a lot of depictions of the tiger, and you'll see it as kind of maybe a traditional image of a tiger, the way it might appear, but also it is represented almost as like a human hybrid. I've done that because for me, animals within my work are representatives of archetypes of human behavior and characters. I'm also really interested in the way in which the tiger is represented within folk tales, particularly within Korean culture. This is because it was almost an entry point for me learning about stories of the past from my mother. So I vividly remember the story of the persimmon and the tiger. So I think a lot of those images have come back to me as I'm working today as an adult, as an artist, and you can see how that has influenced my work. I'm also really interested in the way in which animals specifically have very symbolic meaning across global cultures, and the way in which folk paintings particularly used animals almost as symbols or maybe words to describe different personality traits or provide moral messaging for people that were reading them. The tiger specifically is also really interesting because it's quite an important identitarian part of being a Korean person. Oftentimes when you look at the map of Korea in kind of traditional illustrations, it will appear as either a rabbit or a tiger. This is something that's been really interesting to me. It's been used as kind of a national symbol of who Koreans are, but also within a lot of traditional religious and spiritual painting, Buddhist and shamanic included. I was always really interested in the way in which a tiger would accompany certain deities, and so you would associate the representation of that animal with a kind of sacredness or spiritual, within a spiritual framework. So I thought that was interesting to include. So I think within the past about 7 or 8 years of my practice, I've really been focused on live performance, sound, sometimes moving image, and a lot of textile work. I haven't really focused too much on images of people or working within portraiture. Even though I'm constantly thinking about identities, I'm usually doing that within the framework of what people are wearing. So oftentimes in my work, you'll see images of garments or costumes. And for me, I was always really interested in the absence of the body to talk about people or characters. This is kind of the first time I've really ventured into working within portraiture, again, within image making. And so, I think audiences might feel like the introduction of these older women is new, but it's actually something that I've been really interested in, worked with for the past 7 or 8 years. So I suppose on one hand, I was really inspired by the idea of the grandmother because I myself never met my maternal grandmother. And I think a way in which I was able to really explore or excavate aspects of my family's history was to do so from a speculative position, because there was ways in which I could think about personal histories that were not too sensitive. So rather than speaking directly to my mother or including kind of real life stories about her, I could skip a generation. And this is a way in which I was able to not only think about my personal history, but maybe an imagined history or kind of an imagined relationship I would have had to an ancestral homeland. So this was a more, I suppose, an easier way for me to explore that without feeling like I was including people that might not otherwise want to share too much of themselves. On the other hand, a few years ago, I stumbled upon a really interesting creation myth that's centered around Grandmother Mago in English, or Mago Khalmi in Korean. And so I was really fascinated by this story, not only because it's centered around an elderly woman who was essentially a goddess who built the land formations of East Asia through her excrement and urine and the collection of rocks in her skirt. So this very visceral and vivid image of this old person, this old woman, doing all this physical labor to create the land formations in and around Korea, I always thought was really amazing. But also the idea that this story was lost or forgotten for quite a long time, presumably because it was never written down via academic scribes. So it was a story that maybe was thought of as not as important. And so for me, it was really important to, I suppose, highlight this story, but highlight the parallels in ways that maybe it's more popular within Western society and culture, where we don't necessarily value older women as much, primarily after they've had children, or they choose not to have kids, or they're kind of sexual desires of what society places upon women dissipates, so they become invisibilized. So in many ways, my work is always thinking about the inversion of power structures. And so for me, I'm really interested in kind of elevating the figure or the idea of the older person, older women in specific, as the person that's in the position that holds not only knowledge, but power, wisdom, and strength. And I also think it's really important that, there are connections with other global mythologies and folklore, and older people, older women are also thought of as kind of, if they do hold powers, to be nefarious or evil. And I actually think the opposite of that. I think those kinds of traits that we think of as being the opposite of goodness actually can be things that are quite interesting to explore. So I was interested in kind of bringing that into the exhibition and having people really think about who we consider valuable within society, and maybe hopefully we can start questioning that and reorganizing what kind of social norms dictate upon us. So this is my first kind of solo endeavor within Korea and Seoul. This is where my family is from and where half of my family still lives. It's incredibly rewarding, not only from a professional perspective, but definitely from an emotional place. I feel really happy and excited to be able to share my work here and hopefully broaden the scope of what it means to be a Korean person globally. Of course, my experience will be very different than people that have grown up here, but I also think there are things, hopefully, that audiences here will be able to maybe relearn or experience or explore within the culture that they're already familiar with, but from a new perspective. And so what I mean by that is, as you said, there are a lot of folk references and a lot of kind of familiar image tropes that people here will recognize. But hopefully they'll recognize them in a way that seems maybe uncanny or transformed or unfamiliar, because there is new meaning placed upon things, which I think is really important for artists, particularly when we're referencing the past. What is the kind of intervention or the transformation that happens when an artist interjects and puts something new into that storyline? So I'm really hoping that also people, particularly younger artists, are really proud of the rich cultural history here. And I think coming from the perspective of someone that works in the UK, I come across a lot of young Korean artists, and I would really, really love to see them bring a little bit more of kind of, I suppose, traditional referencing within their work, because I think that those are the aspects that make us really unique and interesting. So it's also really important for us working internationally that we move the canon away from a Eurocentric center where there's such a focus on European art history and place upon or place within our own work a different center point. So irrespective of where you're from, I think it's really important that artists globally start reshifting where the framework is set, and we can have many different center points working at the same time, rather than focusing and elevating something that, you know, has been at the center of what's considered culture for so many years.